Hey, it's Sean from the Commander's Brew. This is Mishra, Tamer of Makfawa from the Brothers' War. This might seem like just another Unearth commander, but there's some really fun synergies going on if you dig around a little bit. I've got a link below for all the cards I'm going to talk about. I'll walk you through the ideas and thought process of how we got to these cool cards for the deck. If you're new to brewing decks, or maybe you're experienced, I think there's something in here for you. I'm not going to give you a deck. I'm going to teach you to deck. Next, I've got to do a bit of business, but I'll be quick, I promise. Wouldn't it be neat to know if you had some sort of connection to Phyrexia? Are you a descendant of a Thran, or perhaps Yawgmoth themselves? You can find out with our quick and easy kit if you sign up for 99andMe. Just give us your name and your address and we'll send a kit right to your door. Instead of giving us a little bit of saliva, we just want you to eat whatever we send you. We promise, it's totally safe, and in just a few short evenings, you'll find out exactly the connection you have with Phyrexia. Spoiler alert, I bet you'll have a connection then. Anyway, here's the real ad from the Wizard's Tower. WizardTower.com, a great place to buy Magic singles and read all sorts of cool articles about Commander and other formats. If you're in Canada, you can use our coupon code BREWBROTHERS to get 5% off your Magic singles. What a deal. And now, back to the show. Unearth is the key ability here. That's where we're going to try to squeeze out every drop of value. The ward isn't bad though. If they're not a token deck, they'll have to really want our stuff dead to want to pay that cost. Our starting point will be how to get the most value out of everything we're unearthing. And they have to be artifacts. Maybe we'll be cheating mana, or maybe they pay us back in some way. It is important to note though that after we unearth something, when it's gone, it's gone. We won't be able to unearth it again, and we won't get any when this thing dies triggers either. It goes straight to exile, but we will get to double dip on entering the battlefield effects. I want to start with mana rocks, and specifically ones that give 3 mana. That way if we ever want to unearth them, it's like we break even on mana. But Sean, what's the point of paying 3 to get back 3? Oh, just wait. There's more value coming. These are mana rocks first and foremost, so we can pay 5 or 6 to immediately get 3 mana back. That could be for another unearth or something bigger. Gilded Lotus is a classic. We pay 5, we get 3 back. It's like we paid 2. Now it has to be one color, so we can't use this 3 mana to unearth something. But as long as we've got another black to go with the 3 red we would make with Gilded Lotus, it's like we had a net gain of 0 mana for that unearth. It was free. Basalt Monolith, another example of a mana rock that taps for 3, so if we were to unearth this, we would get our exact 3 back. And Coveted Jewel might be one of the best for this. Whether we cast this for 6 to get 3 back, or we unearth it for 3, also to get 3 back, we're drawing 3 cards both those times. The great thing about an artifact deck like this is we'll probably have 1 or 2 ways to sacrifice artifacts, so we can make sure our opponents can never get a hold of this while we get to dip twice for that card draw. Having this in the graveyard with Mishra, it's sort of like having free draw 3 cards. And even something like Lotus Bloom is especially interesting because we would have to suspend it. There's no way to cast this normally, but unearthing isn't casting, so we're allowed to unearth this and tap it right away, sack it for 3 mana of any one color. Something like Transmigrant Altar is especially interesting because it also taps for 3, but we have to sack a creature and pay a black. So it's like a tap for 2. But we have 2 ways to use creatures to get something for them. Since we're going to be unearthing things, and a lot of those will probably be creatures, here's a way to turn those creatures into value after we've unearthed them. And something like Ogre Head Helm is especially interesting because we will want to attack with those artifact creatures we've unearthed, and whether it's this or another creature that we've unearthed, we might want to discard our hand and draw 3 cards and get those things in our hand into the graveyard so that we can unearth them later, namely stuff like Metalwork Colossus. But if we've got all kinds of stuff like Gilded Lotus and Coveted Jewels, it is pretty reasonable that we'll be able to cast this for 0. That should come in handy later. There's bound to be a few cards in the deck that we'd rather unearth. There's some stuff we just don't want to cast for face value. So that's where mill and discard comes in. Most of Red's draw comes with a discard, which is only an advantage in a graveyard-centered deck. Duretti Scrap Savant exemplifies this idea. The +2 lets us put 2 key artifacts in the graveyard that we're happy to unearth, or maybe a couple of lands we don't need, and replace them with other cards. And we can swap out artifacts. It's like Unearth, only better, because it doesn't cost us mana, and the things don't get sacrificed at the end. And I have seen Duretti get to their ultimate before. I never want to rely on a Planeswalker getting to their ultimate because why would a table ever let you? But if it does, it's super powerful in this deck. And even stuff like a Thrill of Possibility is just a nice way to be be able to chuck something big into the graveyard so we can unearth it later. Like maybe a meteor golem. I probably don't want to cast this for 7, but I'd love to pay 3 to make that happen. And while we're talking about ways to get cards in the graveyard, mill is also an excellent way to do this. Mesmeric Orb is a pretty efficient way to do that. It can be a bit dangerous because everybody gets to take benefit from it. Some players also like to have things in the graveyard, so when we cast this, other people might be benefiting. But it's a fast way for us to get a ton of cards in the graveyard and it only costs us 2. Speaking of costing 2, Perpetual Timepiece. Certainly a little bit slower, but we get to do 2 every turn. And there's the added bonus of being able to exile this and shuffle everything from our graveyard back in the deck. It's a useful ability to have because when you're doing stuff with the graveyard as much as we plan to, your opponents take notice and they'll try to exile it. Undercity Informer is a nice synergistic way to get more cards in our graveyard, especially if we're unearthing artifact creatures. Now we pay an additional 1 on top of the 3, and we'll mill until we hit a land, possibly putting way more cool artifacts in there. And of course, Sir Conrad the Grim. We got cards coming in, we got cards going out of the graveyard. Conrad will do a lot of damage this way. Now, if only he was an artifact, it would be nice to be able to unearth him for a huge turn. Things that we've unearthed are not long for this game, but that doesn't mean we can't get a little bit more value out of them. We're commander players. Our middle name is value. And we can get extra value even before things have hit the battlefield. Torma the Desecrator pays us with a tapped 2/2 zombie every time we unearth a creature, or an artifact, just when a card leaves. Desecrated Tomb is the one that cares about creatures specifically, and we get a black bat creature token. And then something like Witch's Oven is interesting because as we bring artifact creatures back from the graveyard, they're going to get exiled after they're done unearthing, but if we sack them to Witch's Oven, we can turn them into a food token, sort of. It lets us keep artifact tokens on the battlefield if that's important to us. Okay, here's a very cool little combo that I think is very interesting. We start with Salvaging Station. This lets us bring back tiny artifacts, and whenever a creature is put into a graveyard, whenever it dies, we get to untap this. So as long as we've got creatures dying, we can untap this as many times as we want and bring back as many tiny artifacts as we want. And the tiny artifact I'm thinking of is Lotus Bloom. Every time we bring this back, it's like we've got another 3 mana. And these go so nicely with Grinding Station. Now, I don't want to sack the Lotus Bloom to this, I want to sack some other artifact. But whenever we do, I'm going to target myself and mill 3. And that little Lotus Bloom that keeps coming back, that's the one that untaps this. And that artifact creature I keep sacrificing, that untaps the Salvaging Station, loop-de-loop-de-loop. We're going to run out of other artifact creatures to sack eventually, but this seems like a pretty cool thing we could do. And if we can mill most of the deck, maybe the Cauldron of Eternity can come down. We'll probably be able to cast it for black, or at the very least unearth it for 3. And if we can somehow get an empty library, we can make it so a creature dies and it goes on the bottom so it's the only thing in our library. Is that worth something? It's probably good with Grenzo Dungeon Warden either way. It might be tough to get Grenzo big enough for that to matter, and we would need a bunch more cards to turn that into something, but maybe someone out there who's smarter than I am can figure out something cool to do that way. So let's talk about rectangles. That Witch's Oven has me thinking that there might be ways to make a ton of artifact tokens. Maybe the thing we unearth will get exiled, but if it brings along some extra rectangles with it, we get to keep those and squeeze them for value. As I alluded to before, sometimes it's just really useful to have a ton of things on the battlefield. Stuff to sacrifice, stuff to do stuff with, stuff that cares about other stuff. I'm talking rectangles. Mere Battlesphere, it's expensive, but it brings 5 rectangles to the table. The Battlesphere itself and 4 other Mir. It's a fantastic attacker too, though, if we unearth it. And regardless of whether this gets exiled at the end, we get to keep the 4 extra Mir that come with it when we do unearth it. Similarly with Genesis Chamber, every time we're unearthing a creature, they will be non-token by definition, and we'll get an extra 1/1 colorless artifact creature token. It's another creature, it's another artifact. It's a lot of stuff we care about. And then let's look at Mirror Works. We pay 3 to unearth a non-token artifact, creature or otherwise. Then we pay another 2 to get Mirror Works in on the action. The original will be exiled, but that token copy, that sticks around. 5 mana, return anything we want from our graveyard to the battlefield as a token. Could be good. Precursor Golem's another way to bring a couple of extra golems with it. It's scary to think that someone could eliminate all your golems at once, but we do have the ability to sacrifice this Precursor Golem, the main one, so that those other golems are just hanging around doing nothing. And if you want to talk rectangles, I want to talk about Olivia's Attendants. This is a 6 mana vampire, but whenever it deals damage, you create that many blood tokens. Notice it doesn't say combat damage. I mean, if I do unearth this, I'm gonna do 6 to something. That's 6 blood tokens right there. But imagine, if you will, putting a Chandra's Ignition targeting Olivia's Attendants. That's gonna do 6 damage to each opponent, each player, each creature, except for Olivia's attendants. What's that gotta be, like 60 blood tokens? 120 blood tokens? Chandra's Ignition is a very risky move because if someone removes Olivia's attendants in response, you get nothing for it. But man, and if we're talking about having tons of artifacts lying around, we gotta consider Improvise for something like Inspiring Statuary. Now all those 6-drop creatures are pretty cheap if we can tap a bunch of dumb trinkety artifacts to cast them. And then Saheeli's Directive? Ooh, that's gotta feel good, right? Flipping over every single artifact left in your deck? It's probably a little bit less effective if we milled ourselves a ton, but there's another reason to shuffle everything back into the library. Artifacts are coming in, artifacts are going out. We're generating a ton of in-game materials. Our battlefield's loaded. So then what if this was some sort of pinger deck? And if we're pinging things, what is the best target to ping? Our opponents. Reckless Fireweaver. In any of these cases where we've got a bunch of artifacts coming into play, this thing will do a ton of damage to our opponents. Ingenious Artillerist? Same deal, costs another mana to come down. 3 is a lot more than 2 in some cases, but redundancy's nice. And if all these things coming in tend to be creatures, I'm going to lean towards Witty Roastmaster. And either way, they're leaving our graveyard, so Fuming Effigy is doing 1 point every time something like that happens too. And now, if I'm looking at a bunch of red pinger effects, I gotta consider Torbrand Thane of Redfell. Now all those things are doing 3 damage every time something comes in. Embermaw Hellion, a little bit more expensive, a little bit less damage, but it's another of those effects. We've even got something like Mechanized Warfare now for a 3-mana enchantment. That's the cheapest way I can think of to get an extra damage from our red sources. And although Torbrand is not an artifact, we can't unearth it. That's where something like Dread Return comes in. I love Dread Return with any mill strategy. It's so valuable to have an effect that we want that we can cast from the graveyard. It's much more reliable that way. Okay, so what if you did want to brew around a special creature? Maybe something like Torbrand. He'll give us the key pinging damage we need to win, or maybe it's Marionette Master for sacking artifacts for a win. Mishra can only unearth artifacts. It's on the text. And it's pretty challenging to find ways of getting these creatures back. Now, since Mishra is only allowed to get back artifacts, I'm going to look for ways to turn things in our graveyard into artifacts, and honestly, it's not cheap. Man, that black deck from the Warhammer Precons is jammed full of value. What's that one up to now, $400 or something? Anyway, Biotransference, that's a $20 card now, and it's a way to make all the creatures in our graveyards artifacts in addition to their other types. This is a way we can unearth something key. And even still, when we're casting artifacts, we're making more artifacts. This thing does a lot. Unearthing is not cast though. A cheaper version of that might be Whip of Erebos. I never really noticed this before, but this is just unearth. It adds a ton of mana cost to the thing, but if we've got a couple of combo pieces in creature form, it might be worth it. Still $8 though. You know, if we're feeling like millionaires, I gotta talk about Dockside Extortionist. Everybody knows this card needs a reprint because it's $50, but it makes a ton of treasures, which is a ton of artifacts, which is probably a ton of ping. It's just a very good card. Being able to unearth it, also excellent. But then that makes me think about stuff like Flame Shadow Conjuring. Again, unearthing always is going to be non-token creatures, so we can just add a red to the unearth cost with Mishra, and now we get an extra token. They're both going to get exiled at the next end step, but if we're doing stuff like a Mirror Battlesphere, that brings a ton of extra mirror, extra artifacts, extra rectangles along with it. And then Mirror March is probably too expensive at 6, but man, I love the chances of getting a whole bunch of copies of things. It's just too exciting. And as usual, here's a couple more fun cards that I couldn't fit in the episode anywhere else. They do some pretty cool things with the deck. And depending on which flavor of a brew you go with, they're either good or unbelievably good. You'll have to decide if you're more heavy creature, more heavy artifact trinkety tokens like blood or treasure, things like that. But anyway you go, Kuldotha Forge Master seems pretty good. And it's also especially good if we unearth it. Paying 3 to be able to sack 3 artifacts and tutor an artifact right into play seems very strong in a deck like this. Bolas the Citadel's a cool target to hit with that. I just like this card, and being able to unearth it too to get that sack to make each opponent lose 10 life could be a game-winning play. Arcbound Crusher is neat. If you're the type of deck that's going to put in a ton of artifacts, this thing will get huge. And it has trample. That's very nice. And the first time it dies, you can put those counters on another artifact creature. But I should remind you again that Unearth doesn't die. they get exiled instead. Something like Currency Converter is very peculiar. It's cheap to come down, and if we have incidental discard, this is very useful, or we can do it manually. But then the weird part is that stuff gets exiled, and you might be thinking, well, we can't unearth it then. But then we put it back into the graveyard, and we either make a treasure token or something like a non-land card to get a 2/2 rogue creature token. It's a little bit of a hoop, but I don't mind doing it. And something like Bloodforged Battle Axe. Here's another thing that we can also bring back with Unearth, and when this thing deals damage, we make a copy of this, and that copy sticks around. And the copies make copies, and the copies make copies, etc., etc. And Bosch Iron Golem. Any deck with a ton of artifacts coming in and out probably wants Bosch. 4 mana to deal a ton of damage anywhere, and is Bosch what you were thinking of when I brought up Metalwork Colossus earlier? It's like they're best friends. Another commander that seems pretty fun. You've done it again, Wizards. If you got some fun inspiration to brew a deck based on this episode, I'd really appreciate a like and subscribe. And if you really want to support the show, you can head on over to patreon.com/commandersbrew. Support through there goes directly to the show. And you can get in on our fun Discord for more brews. I'll have another cool deck for you next week. And in the meantime, you keep being you. The world's a better place for it. See you next time. Oh, and if you like Rakdos decks, I would recommend this one about Lagomos. We're in the command zone. I've got a lot of fun ways to get 5 creatures to die, and surprisingly, he's a lot more versatile than just a bunch of toolbox stuff. Demons.